Welcome to War and Untold Stories. Here, we explore the hidden side of history. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments. In the dawn of the 20th century, the world watched as two empires, one ancient and one sprawling, clashed in a conflict that would reshape the global balance of power. This was the Russo-Japanese War, a brutal, year-and-a-half-long struggle fought over ambitions in Manchuria and Korea. On one side, the Russian Empire, a colossal giant stretching across two continents, confident in its military might. On the other, the Empire of Japan, a nation that had undergone a stunningly rapid modernization, eager to assert its new strength on the world stage. The question that echoed then, and still resonates today, is not just who was victorious, but who truly won. The first shots were fired not with a declaration of war, but with a surprise torpedo attack. On the night of February 8, 1904, Japanese destroyers descended upon the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur, a strategic warm-water port in modern-day Dalian, China. This audacious strike crippled Russia's Pacific Fleet and set the tone for the entire conflict. Japan, though smaller, was agile, prepared, and underestimated its opponent's resolve. The world, accustomed to the dominance of Western powers, was stunned. Russia, under Tsar Nicholas II, was caught off guard. Their forces were vast but poorly coordinated. Their supply lines stretched perilously thin across the vast Siberian expanse. The legendary Trans-Siberian Railway, still incomplete, became a bottleneck, a symbol of Russia's logistical nightmare. On the ground, the war became a grueling siege. Port Arthur, the prize of the conflict, turned into a bloody stalemate. Japanese forces under General Nogi Maresuke launched relentless human wave assaults against heavily fortified Russian positions. The battles for hills like 203-meter Hill became infamous for their horrific casualty rates. For months, tens of thousands of soldiers perished in trench warfare, a grim foreshadowing of the carnage that would define the First World War a decade later. While the Japanese ultimately captured the fortress in January 1905, the cost was staggering, a victory paid for in a sea of blood. This Pyrrhic victory bled Japan's army and its treasury, pushing the nation to its limits. Simultaneously, major land battles raged across Manchuria. At the Battle of Mukden in early 1905, nearly 750,000 men clashed in what was, at the time, the largest land battle in modern history. Again, Russian forces were hampered by indecisive leadership and logistical failures. Japanese armies, though outnumbered, executed a brilliant large-scale envelopment, forcing the Russians into a chaotic retreat. It was a decisive operational victory for Japan, but not a knockout blow. The Russian army, though battered, was not destroyed. It fell back, regrouped, and prepared to continue the fight, its immense reserves of manpower far from exhausted. Japan, on the other hand, was running on fumes. Its economy was strained to the breaking point, and it simply could not afford a prolonged war of attrition. Desperate for a decisive victory to end the war, Russia made a monumental gamble. They dispatched their Baltic fleet, a massive armada of warships, on an arduous 7-month, 18,000 nautical mile journey from Europe, around Africa, and across the Indian Ocean to challenge the Japanese Navy. It was an epic voyage, plagued by mechanical failures, difficult coaling operations, and international diplomatic hurdles. The world watched, breathless, as this armada of the damned steamed towards its destiny. The Russian commander, Admiral Rozhdestvensky, knew the odds were against him. His crews were inexperienced, his ships a mix of modern battleships and outdated vessels. Their destination was Vladivostok, the only other major Russian port in the region. To get there, they had to pass through the strait that separates Korea and Japan, the Tsushima Strait. And it was here, in the waters of Tsushima, that the fate of the war was sealed. On May 27, 1905, the Japanese combined fleet, commanded by the brilliant Admiral Togo Heihachiro, lay in wait. Togo had drilled his fleet to perfection. They were faster, their gunnery was more accurate, and their strategy was superior. As the Russian fleet entered the strait in a disorganized formation, Togo executed his legendary maneuver, crossing the T. This allowed the full broadside of his battleships to fire upon the lead Russian ships, which could only fire back with their forward guns. The result was a slaughter. In less than 24 hours, the Russian Baltic fleet was annihilated. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the battle, 21 were sunk, many were captured, and only a handful escaped to neutral ports. It was one of the most decisive naval victories in history, a catastrophe that broke Russia's will to fight. News of the Tsushima disaster sent shockwaves through St. Petersburg, compounding the growing unrest at home. The war had always been unpopular, and military defeats fueled public anger against the Tsarist regime. The 1905 revolution was erupting across the empire, with strikes, peasant uprisings, and military mutinies. Tsar Nicholas II, facing collapse from within and humiliation from without, had no choice but to seek peace. Japan, despite its stunning military successes, was also desperate for an end to the conflict. The nation was financially exhausted and had suffered immense casualties. They had won the battles, but they lacked the resources to win the war outright by marching on Moscow. Both sides were ready for the negotiating table. At the invitation of U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, Russian and Japanese diplomats met in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The negotiations were tense. Japan, the clear military victor, expected significant territorial gains and a massive financial indemnity to cover its war costs. Russia, however, negotiated from a position of surprising strength. Their envoy, Sergei Witte, skillfully exploited Japan's financial weakness, refusing to pay any reparations. The resulting Treaty of Portsmouth was a bitter pill for the Japanese public. Japan gained control of Korea, the southern half of Sakhalin Island, and lease rights to Port Arthur, but they received no money. Riots erupted in Tokyo as citizens felt their immense sacrifice had been betrayed by a humiliating peace. So, who really won? On paper, Japan was the victor. It had achieved its primary strategic goals, halting Russian expansion and establishing itself as the dominant power in East Asia. For the first time in the modern era, an Asian nation had defeated a major European power, inspiring nationalist movements across the continent. It was a victory of immense symbolic importance, shattering the myth of Western invincibility. Yet, it was a victory that came at an unsustainable price. The war drained Japan's treasury and sowed the seeds of a militaristic ideology that would lead the nation down a dark path towards the Second World War. For Russia, the war was an unmitigated disaster. It was a profound national humiliation that exposed the corruption and incompetence of the Tsarist regime, accelerating its eventual collapse in 1917. The defeat was a catalyst for revolution, a brutal wake-up call that the empire was rotting from the inside. However, in the long run, by losing the war, Russia was forced to turn its focus inward, away from costly imperial adventures in the Far East and towards its own internal crises. The defeat, in a way, may have inadvertently saved the Russian state from an even greater, more immediate collapse by ending a war it could no longer sustain. The conflict didn't just create a winner and a loser, it fundamentally altered the trajectory of both empires, setting them on new and ultimately tragic courses. The echoes of their clash in 1905 continue to shape the world we live in today. Thank you for watching. If you found this journey into history insightful, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world.